Tedros, our Director General, will address you first, then I will open the floor to questions. Joining Dr. Tedros to answer questions today are, in the room, Dr. Mariangela Shimau, our Assistant Director General for Access to Medicines, Dr. Maria Van Kerkhove, our Technical Lead for COVID-19, Dr. Bruce Aylward, our Senior Advisor to the Director General, who's leading the work on the accelerator, and joining us virtually is Dr. Mike Ryan, the Executive Director for our Emergencies Program, and we hope Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, yes, she has joined, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, our Chief Scientist. As always, this briefing is being translated simultaneously into the 6 official UN languages: Arabic, Chinese, French, English, Spanish, and Russian, plus Portuguese and Hindi. But I've got some very good news for Arabic speakers, Arabic and Hindi speakers. The Zoom has been upgraded, so the language button is the correct button. You simply press Arabic. However, if you're not seeing it, you will need to upgrade your Zoom. So I'm telling you that now if you're having problems. So now, without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Tedros. Dr. Tedros, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Margareta. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Last week, I sent a letter to all member states requesting them to join the vaccine arm of the ACT Accelerator. I'm pleased to announce that as of today, 172 countries are now engaging with the COVAX Global Vaccines Facility, which has both the largest and most diverse COVID-19 vaccine portfolio in the world. At present, there are 9 vaccines that are part of this dynamic portfolio, which is constantly being reviewed and optimized to ensure access to the best possible range of products. Even now, discussions are ongoing with 4 more producers, and a further 9 vaccines are currently under evaluation for the longer term. The facility is the critical mechanism for joint procurement and pooling risk across multiple vaccines so that whatever vaccine is proven to be safe and effective, all countries within the facility will be able to access them. Most importantly, it is the mechanism to enable a globally coordinated rollout. This is in the interests of all countries, even those that have invested with individual manufacturers independently. We're working with vaccine manufacturers to provide all countries that join the effort timely and equitable access to all vaccines licensed and approved. This doesn't just pool risk, it also means that prices will be kept as low as possible. New research outlines that global competition for vaccine doses could lead to price spiking exponentially in comparison to a collaborative effort such as COVAX facility. It would also lead to a prolonged pandemic, as only a small number of countries would get most of the supply. Vaccine nationalism only helps the virus. The world has so far invested $12 trillion in keeping economies moving. Investing in the COVAX facility is the fastest way to end this pandemic and ensure a sustainable economic recovery. Through the allocation framework, COVAX will ensure that low, middle, and high-income countries all receive the vaccine in a timely way as soon as there is supply of a safe and effective vaccine. The success of the COVAX facility hinges not only on countries signing up to it, but also filling key funding gaps for both the research and development work and to support lower-income economies within the facility. Our only way out of this pandemic is together. Initially, when there will be limited supply, it's important to provide the vaccine to those at highest risk around the world. This includes health workers, as they are on the front lines in this pandemic and critical to saving lives and stabilizing the overall health system. It also includes people over 65 years old and those with certain diseases that put them at higher risk of dying from COVID-19. As supply increases, the next stage of the vaccine rollout would be expanded based on an assessment of each country's vulnerability to the virus. A number of vaccines are now in the final stage of clinical trials, and we all hope we will have multiple successful candidates that are both safe and effective. In order to be able to secure enough doses to roll out the vaccines, the next step for the partnership is for countries to make binding commitments in support of the COVAX facility. While we're grateful for the funds already committed towards the COVAX facility, more is urgently needed to continue to move the portfolio forward. The goal of the mechanism is to deliver at least 2 billion doses of safe, effective vaccines by the end of 2021. As governments invest trillions into economic stimulus, the COVAX facility offers a huge return on investment. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and as I said last week, together we can do it. While investing collectively in research and development on vaccines, we need to also use the tools at hand that we have now to suppress this virus. As governments hone their track and trace systems to test, isolate and care for patients, and trace and quarantine their contacts, everyone can play their part. If we all physically distance, clean our hands regularly, wear masks, and keep informed, we can collectively break the chains of transmission. Do it all now. Communicating challenges and solutions has and will continue to be key to ending this pandemic. More than 4 million people have enrolled in our training courses through the openwho.org online learning platform. WHO is partnering with the World Federation of Science Journalists to accurately communicate the intricate science as it evolves. Through our regional offices, WHO has organized webinars in multiple languages for journalists to counter misinformation, and a massive open online course for journalists covering the pandemic was created through a partnership between WHO, UNESCO, and the Knight Center for Journalism at the University of Texas, Austin. More than 9,000 journalists from 162 countries enrolled. This online training was delivered in English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, and will soon be available in Arabic, Chinese, Russian, and Hindi. More information about these online courses is available on our website. We're learning new things about this virus every day, and journalists are critical to helping news communicate that information to the public in a way that saves lives. We will continue to promote science, solutions, and solidarity because we believe to our core that we do it best when we do it together. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tedros. I'll now open the floor to questions. Remember, because we have so many people online, please restrict your questions to one question. And remember, you can ask your questions in any of the 6 UN languages and plus Portuguese. And now the first person on the list is Jason Gale. We're going to Australia. Jason Gale from Bloomberg. Can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thanks, Margaret. Apologies, my question is not directly related to COVAX. Researchers at the University of Hong Kong are reporting today that a reinfection in a 33-year-old immunocompetent Hong Konger 142 days after a symptomatic infection. The subsequent infection was caused by a different virus as confirmed by genome sequencing, and it was asymptomatic. This is the first documented case of reinfection that I'm aware of out of more than 23 million COVID-19 cases. How should we interpret this finding, and what are the implications for herd immunity and for vaccination? Thanks.
Thanks very much for the question. I just got a hold of the press release that was provided by Hong Kong U. So I had a quick look at that. I think what we need to, from the very beginning, we've been talking about when people are infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and that our expectation is that people who are infected with this virus develop an immune response. What we are learning about infection is that people do develop an immune response, and what is not completely clear yet is for how long, how strong that immune response is, and for how long that immune response lasts. There's very good data coming out from research studies which are being conducted all over the world that are looking at this immune response for people who have had a mild infection, people who have had asymptomatic infection, people who have had severe infection. And we're seeing that they do develop an immune response, and most people do. And so what we understand from the press release is that this may be an example of reinfection. And if you remember last week I was asked about this, and I had said that in cases like this it would be good if sequencing could be done. And in a place like Hong Kong, where they have very strong facilities, they can do that, and in fact they have done. I understand from the press release that there's 24 nucleotide difference between the first virus and the second virus. What I think is really important is that we put this into context. As you outlined in the question yourself, there's been more than 24 million cases reported to date, and we need to look at something like this on a population level. And so it's very important that we document this, and that in countries that can do this, if sequencing can be done, that would be very, very helpful. But we need to not jump to any conclusions. To say even if this is the first documented case of reinfection, it is possible, of course, because with our experience with other human coronaviruses, and the MERS coronavirus and the SARS-CoV-1 coronavirus, we know that people have an antibody response for some time, but it may wane. What we know specifically about immune response for SARS-CoV-2 is that there are a number of studies underway following the same individuals over time. These are called longitudinal studies, which follow the same individual at monthly time periods or every few months. Remember, we're 8 months into this pandemic, and so these studies are still continuing. From the longitudinal studies that are underway, not all of them are published yet, we do see a strong antibody response that stays at that same level. There are some cross-sectional surveys that have been recently published that look at the same population over time, not the same individuals, but the same group of people from the same population. And it was some suggestion that there may be a slight decline or waning in immunity. Again, we really need these studies to be conducted so that we really understand what this immune response looks like. But I don't want people to be afraid. We need to ensure that people understand that when they are infected, even if they have a mild infection, that they do develop an immune response. In this particular case, it's very important that we look, and I haven't read the study, so I don't have the answer to this yet, to see if this individual developed a neutralizing antibody response, which is what will protect from reinfection. So still a lot of work underway, really good studies that are underway, but it's great to see documentation and these good studies and these being shared.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Kerkhove. For the next question, we're going to Malta, to Monique in the Malta newsroom. Monique, could you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Good afternoon. Hi, it's Monique. My question is, what is the World Health Organization's view if a vaccine is found? Would it be mandatory for everyone?
Thank you very much for the question about vaccines and their use going forward. The question was specifically whether or not there would be a requirement for vaccination. And obviously, immunization policy and requirements are in the national domain, and so those decisions would be made at the national level. But clearly, what we're looking for here is the greatest possible acceptance of a vaccine and that vaccine-seeking behavior. So our work will really emphasize ensuring people understand the benefits of the vaccines, the safety of vaccines, the quality of vaccines, and that we can encourage as much as possible the seeking of vaccines rather than mandatory requirements.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aylward. Now we're going to move to India, to Avijit in AMN News. Avijit, can you unmute yourself and please ask your question?
Thank you for taking my question. We just had the Russian vaccine announced, and there's been a lot of enthusiasm amongst people all over. So how effective is the vaccine, and what is WHO's comment on that?
Do you want me to take that?
Dr. Sumia? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. The first thing is that WHO, of course, welcomes all vaccine development programs around the world. And we're very encouraged by the fact that there are so many vaccine development programs and over 30 candidates now in various stages of clinical development in phase 1, 2, or 3 clinical trials. We have also put out quite early on in May this year, the criteria for what would be considered a safe and effective vaccine. It's called a target product profile, and it describes the kind of sort of a benchmarks that we would like a vaccine to meet. So a minimum of 50% efficacy in preventing infection with a lower bound of at least 30%. So a vaccine that offers at least 30% protection at the population level, and of course is safe. Now, safety, again, is assessed short-term, but also needs to be assessed longer-term because there are some side effects which you only pick up later on. So that is why it's so important to have these clinical trials conducted according to the standards and norms so that the data can then be examined by the experts before a decision is made on whether or not this vaccine should be licensed. So we have started discussions now with the authorities in Russia to learn more about the vaccine candidate, and we've requested for the data on efficacy and safety. We understand that it's gone through some preliminary human studies and that it is about to get into a phase 3 clinical trial, which will really be the test of efficacy. So we look forward to discussing with the Russian authorities as well as seeing the data that is available so far and then having a dialogue on what the further needs should be and how further studies would need to be done. And this is why we're also promoting the idea of a solidarity vaccine trial, where many different manufacturers, developers, countries can participate, both as trial sites to test different vaccine candidates, but also to provide the vaccine candidates into this large global multi-arm adaptive clinical trial that we think will be both a cost-effective and an efficient way of testing as many candidates as possible in the shortest period of time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swaminathan. So we have no more comments in the room. I will now move to Christine from ABC America. Christine, please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about monoclonal antibodies. Could you speak to what they are, how they can be used, and limitations to getting the drug to the population at large? Because it sounds like a groundbreaking candidate therapeutic that may play an important role in helping curb the pandemic. Thank you in advance.
Thank you, Christine.
I could start, Margaret.
Yes, good. I was going to say it's for you.
Might want to add. So monoclonal antibodies are basically highly specific antibodies which act by preventing the virus from binding to the cell receptor and therefore preventing the virus from entering the human cells and causing an infection. Now, monoclonal antibodies have been fairly recent technological advance, say over the last 10 to 15 years, but have been used for a number of diseases, both chronic diseases, immunological disorders, cancers, and more interest now in using these for infectious diseases. Now, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, there have been several efforts to develop monoclonal antibodies, and also there are different ways of doing it. You could do it in humanized mice,
can also do it by extracting antibodies from people who have recovered and then purifying them, or it could also be done de novo in the laboratory. So different groups, different companies have taken different approaches. And at the moment, there are several antibodies, monoclonals, either used singly or in combination. So you can also use a combination of 2 or 3 antibodies. And this was something that was tested in Ebola and found to be very effective in a clinical trial done in the DRC. There were 2 different monoclonal antibodies that were actually found to be better than antiviral drugs in treating Ebola. So at the moment, we are aware of several clinical trials for the monoclonal antibodies. The NIH is sponsoring a number of these trials, looking at these both for prevention of infection. So you can give it to people who are been in contact, high-risk contacts, nursing home residents, etc., to see if you could actually prevent the infection. It's also being tested in early disease when people are not sick, outpatients, and also in those who've been hospitalized with more moderate to severe illness. So it's being tested across the spectrum, and it is one of the promising therapeutics on the horizon. I think the issue that you mentioned is very important, which is the possibility of scaling this and really making it accessible to people around the world, because it is a complex product to make. These facilities do not exist in all parts of the world. It could also be expensive, of course, depending on what technology is used. And therefore, we're looking very closely and also talking to many partners to see how technology transfer could be accomplished, and how, if once these are found to be safe and effective, just like vaccines, you also want them to have broader access. But it is a challenge, because technologically it is going to be difficult, but it can be done. And it would be useful in the long run to build this capacity in countries around the world, because monoclonal antibodies are likely to be therapy for other infectious diseases as well. And so this is a sort of platform technology that we really urgently need technology transfer to happen. Mary Angela might want to add something to this.
Thank you, Soumya. Just to highlight, the affordability is likely to be an issue because of capacity of production. Nowadays, the monoclonal antibodies that are already on the market for other diseases are extremely expensive. So they are among the high-cost drugs. So, this is a concern. First, we have to have 1 or 2 monoclonal antibodies that prove to be safe and efficacious, and we need to have scale-up capacity. To that, let me say that through the Act A, the therapeutics pillar, we have been working already on the landscaping and the possibilities to scale up capacity for some of these candidates who are proving to be more potentially effective and safe. The other issue that will come to light if we do have one of these drugs available for COVID will be also the flexibilities around the use of biosimilars that will potentially scale up the availability of the product in the world. So there are a lot of issues. It's very good, welcome news that potentially we have a good or more than one monoclonal antibody. The other side is we need to make sure they would be affordable and we would be able to scale them up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No more. Oh, there is one more intervention. I think Dr. Aylward.
I think we've covered the main points on this, but there was an interesting part of the question was about how they would be used. And one of the discussions we've had over the last couple of weeks, and the Director General has emphasized this, is that while vaccines are going to be an extremely important part of what we use in the fight against COVID, there will also be some limitations. And one we're concerned about is how well these vaccines, like others, will work in populations like the elderly and others. And this is where sometimes an intervention like the monoclonal antibodies can be very important, because potentially this may work in populations where a vaccine or others wouldn't. And that comes back to that point we've made over the last couple of weeks, and again the Director General emphasized today. The ACT Accelerator is really all about looking at that comprehensive integrated portfolio. We need diagnostics, we need therapeutics, we need vaccines, and the comments and questions just now about monoclonal antibodies really emphasize that. One last point I would make is that, again, you asked about the limitations. You know, there's such challenges in proving that monoclonal antibodies actually work. The design of these trials is complicated because of the endpoints in them, especially when you're looking to prevent a disease or change the course of what is usually a mild disease. And then the production ones we talked about, and then even the challenges of using them and making sure they're in the right places at the right time. So again, one more, like you say, promising part of the armamentarium against this disease. But like all of them, none are silver bullets, but together, hopefully, the combination will work like one.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aylward, Dr. Shamal, and Dr. Swaminathan. For the next question, we're going to Bosnia, to Esmir from N1 TV. Esmir, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Very well. Please go ahead.
So my question is, do you know how many countries from the Western Balkans has already joined COVAX? And also in line of this, some instances here in the Western Balkans are considering purchasing vaccines from Russia at the moment. Would you recommend to them to go ahead and purchase a vaccine from Russia, or to wait till we have a vaccine through COVAX accessible? Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is a question for Dr. Aylward.
Thank you very much for the question. So as the Director General mentioned, I think last week and again this morning, we've had 80 countries, just over, countries and economies actually express an interest to join the COVAX facilities. These would be self-financing countries, in addition to the 92 countries that would receive financial assistance through the COVAX facility, for a total of over 170. This number represents countries from every single region and area of the world. As many of the conversations are ongoing about the terms of the facility, as well as negotiations around those. Not all countries want that their names be publicized. So for that reason, as the negotiations are ongoing, we won't be able to talk about specific countries, other than some that have asked and said that they could use their names to promote the facility and the importance of it and the confidence in it. But we prefer that what's available on the website and the Gavi websites and our own gives you an update on who's joined at this point and has made their names public. Oh, also, sorry, on the point about joining COVAX as well, I want to be clear. It was a bit of a milestone yesterday, as the terms of agreement actually went out to all potentially what we call fully self-financing countries for the COVAX facility. And those are the terms now that lay out joining, whether or not you're joining through what we call the confirmed doses way, or through option doses, and to make an indication, confirm your intent by the 31st of August. So that was an important milestone that went out just yesterday. So in the coming weeks, we'll have a sense of how many actually have confirmed intent to join. Because again, the question to me was how many have joined, and at this point we're in that expression of interest with confirmation of intent by the 31st of August. In terms of the second question about if WHO recommendations read specific vaccines, I think Dr. Swaminathan already answered that question, and WHO recommends vaccines through its pre-qualification or emergency use licensing process, which a vaccine would have to go through before we would, as an organization, recommend it for purchase.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aylward. For the next question, we go to Kai Kupferschmidt from Science. Kai, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thanks a lot. I was going to ask how many countries have actually signed up, but I guess we've covered that with COVAX. So let me ask something else. How do you see, I mean, you're pitching COVAX as a possibility to do both, right? Countries that are doing their kind of bilateral agreements might still sign up to COVAX. But doesn't that still kind of, interfere with each other? I mean, basically, if you want to equitably distribute the vaccine, globally, then all the vaccine that countries are hoovering up with their bilateral agreements are basically outside of that scope, right? So how do you see the kind of connection between these two different mechanisms?
That's also for Dr. Elwood.
Thanks, Kai. And in terms of how many countries have signed up, you're absolutely right. But the number, again, is over 170 countries now are engaged in conversations, and that represents over 70% of the world's population. So a huge number. And per your second question, this is so important to ensuring that vaccine gets out to all countries at the same time in a managed order so that we reduce risk around the world as rapidly as possible and then get the world's societies open again, health systems safe, and economies open as well. And on the question about does the new changes in the design of the COVAX facility affect the ability to equitably allocate the vaccine, actually it makes it much better, because whether or not countries have signed bilateral deals or as individual countries or groups of countries, the important thing is how that vaccine is used and the order in which that vaccine is used. And what we're looking for, and the Director General emphasized last week and again today, is the more countries that join forces with the COVAX facility, the more they can work together in a coordinated manner to ensure that we roll these vaccines out at the same time and equitably across countries. Now, not just because this is the right thing to do, but what we've learned over the last few months is this is absolutely essential. No country can emerge from this crisis alone, and what we need is to get our health systems safe and protected again, first and foremost, because that and the severe disease it manages is what is having the knock-on effect with the changes in societal behaviors we've had to promote, as well as, of course, the economic impact. So what we've learned really, in a nutshell, is that the critical thing is to ensure some vaccine gets to all countries as early as possible, and the design changes in COVAX, where we can have the participation of all countries, now provides an even stronger mechanism through which we could coordinate that rollout so that all countries benefit, and most importantly, the entire world comes out of this crisis as rapidly as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Elwood. So now we will go to Chen from China Daily. Chen, could you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, my question is about Beijing made a headline just a few days ago about lifting the mandatory mask wearing restrictions, and actually a lot of Chinese cities have already done that. But I'm actually based in Brussels, Belgium. So, and Brussels has been added by German Foreign Ministry just 2 days ago on the quarantine list, actually more and more by other countries too. So what, according to WHO's experts' view, are the makes a difference? Considering that the whole population of Belgium actually is only half of Beijing's population, but a larger area. So what measures makes a difference or policies? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I will begin. So yes, I think what we're seeing is that a number of countries are taking a risk-based approach to the interventions that need to be used and applying them where and when necessary. So you mentioned Beijing lifting one of their tools that they are using for this, in this example, the use of masks. And masks are one of the tools that can be used in the control of this pandemic, controlling of transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And then you mentioned another country. And so I think what we are seeing is that what countries are doing is that with the surveillance that is taking place, where they are actively looking for cases, where they're using public health measures such as isolation and clinical care for cases, contact tracing and quarantining of contacts of known cases, the use of masks where appropriate, physical distancing, good information. Countries are collecting data. And what they're doing is they're using that data to help advise them on what needs to be done next. Can some of these measures be lifted, or do some of these measures need to be implemented again? And countries are at different stages of the pandemic. And so while many countries are seeing success in suppressing transmission, breaking chains of transmission, they're able to lift some of these measures. And in other countries where measures have been lifted and they're seeing a resurgence in some areas, and we've seen in a number of countries that there are clusters of cases that are happening where people are coming together and congregating, some of these measures need to be implemented more strongly again. So we need to expect this. All countries need to expect this. And we need to continue to use the tools that we have right now, which include active case finding, contact tracing, the use of masks, physical distancing, respiratory etiquette, hand hygiene, and then applying measures where and when necessary. We are very hopeful that countries will not have to impose nationwide measures, but could impose some perhaps smaller, more geographically bound, time-limited bound interventions where they are most needed to get through any resurgence in cases.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Kerkhoff. The next question comes from Estonia, from Ep Ehand from Estonia Public Broadcasting. Ep, could you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question?
Hello, thank you very much for the possibility. I would like to ask again about reopening the schools and transmission of the virus among children. You have said many times that there are a lot of things we don't know, but maybe you could explain once more what we do know and what is your opinion at the moment, and what would be your recommendation number one for schools?
So thank you very much for the question. Indeed, we have a lot of questions about schools, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, as many schools are starting to consider reopening for the school year. There are several things that we are learning about this virus, and we are learning every day something new about this virus, thanks to the incredible work by public health professionals, frontline workers, researchers all over the world. So a special thank you to everyone conducting high-quality research. With regards to schools, we know that schools operate in communities. They don't operate in isolation. So the big thing that we look for is what does transmission look like in the community where those schools operate? So that's first and foremost to really understand. We need to bring transmission under control in the communities where the schools operate. As it relates to SARS-CoV-2 infection among children, there's three things that we are looking at. And we're working with a technical advisory group that we have pulled together to help advise us. We're working with UNICEF, we're working with UNESCO, we're working with a number of partners to consolidate our understanding about this disease in children. First of all, what type of disease is caused in children? And so luckily, the vast majority of children who are infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus appear to have mild disease or asymptomatic infection, and that's good news. But there are young children, there are children that can develop severe disease, and there are children who have died from infection. The second thing that we look at is the amount of infection that is actually happening among children. And this is difficult to measure because most children have mild disease or asymptomatic infection, and so they're not picked up normally with current surveillance systems. So we have seroepidemiology studies that are conducted that looks at if a child had been infected, and this is measured through antibodies. There are a number of studies that are underway, and so the data is still preliminary, and we're looking at studies that look at all the population. What we see from some of the preliminary results of the seroepidemiology studies is that there is some difference in the infection rate among the youngest children versus older children, teenagers. So we do need to distinguish children by age group. The last thing that we look at, the third thing that we look at, not the last thing, the third thing that we look at is transmission among children. And again, most schools, many schools were closed in this beginning of this pandemic. Not all countries closed their schools, but many did. And so many of the children were removed from the school system and brought home. And we know from household transmission studies that children can be infected, and we know that adults can infect children, and we also know that children can infect adults, although that appears to happen less frequently. But again, if we look at transmission, we need to break children down by age group. And there appears to be less transmission among the youngest kids versus kids who are in their teenage years. So this data is preliminary, but the bottom line is that children can be infected. Most children have mild disease, although some children can have serious disease and some children can die. Children can transmit the virus, although there are differences in transmission rate depending on the age, with the youngest children transmitting less. And these are studies that are ongoing. So if there's transmission that's happening in a community, it can enter into the school system. So what we really need to focus on is bringing transmission down in the school system. We have outlined guidance on how schools can reopen safely. Everyone agrees how important it is that schools are operating safely, and we've outlined how that can be done in terms of physical distancing and hand hygiene stations, respiratory etiquette, the potential use of masks by either the workers or the children themselves. And so there are a number of considerations of how the schools can be opened. But again, we really need to focus on reducing transmission in the community first.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Kerkhove. The next question comes from Elaine from Health Policy Watch. Elaine, can you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, thank you for taking my question. We saw last night the announcement by the US FDA that for emergency use authorization of blood plasma from convalescent patients. And I was wondering if you could explain what's the difference between that treatment and that of monoclonal antibodies, which I presume might be a bit more precise or particular, but if you could explain the two and perhaps give us a little thinking about how useful the blood plasma treatment may pretend to be. There is a bit of a debate going on over that as well, as you may know, in the States. Thank you.
I can start. This is Soumya. So, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. So convalescent plasma therapy is actually something that's been used for over 100 years for various infectious diseases. And it's been effective in some and not so effective in others. So as far as COVID is concerned, again, this was one of the early therapies that was begun to be used. Essentially what it involves is collecting plasma from people who have recovered from COVID and then using it to transfuse into someone who's ill. And generally it's been used in severely ill patients who've been hospitalized. There are a number of clinical trials going on around the world looking at convalescent plasma compared to standard of care. And only a few of them have actually reported out on results. And the results are not conclusive, I should say. That the trials have been relatively small, and the results in some cases point to some benefit, but have not been conclusive. And we've been tracking this, and we do ongoing meta-analyses and systematic reviews to see where the evidence is shifting or pointing. And at the moment, it's still very low quality evidence. So we recommend that convalescent plasma is still an experimental therapy. It should be continue to be evaluated in well-designed, randomized clinical trials. There are a few challenges with convalescent plasma as opposed to monoclonal antibodies that we talked about earlier. Monoclonal antibodies, because they're developed in a manufacturing setup under GMP, you know exactly the titer of antibodies and the dose that needs to be given. Whereas convalescent plasma, one of the challenges is each individual may have different titers of neutralizing antibodies after recovery, and it's very difficult to really test that and standardize that. And so it's not one standardized therapy because blood is being drawn from different patients and then being transfused. So that's one of the challenges. There's also limited capacity for plasmapheresis, where you have to separate the plasma from the cells in the blood, and not all countries and not all hospitals have that kind of facility. And also there's a lack of donors, so there isn't enough to go around. But I think the most important question really is about its efficacy and safety being proven in randomized trials, and I hope that we will get that evidence in the coming weeks. Of course, countries can do emergency use listing if they feel that the benefits outweigh the risks and they want to provide, but that's usually done while awaiting the more definitive evidence, which is yet to come. Thanks. Mary Angela might want to add.
Dr. Elwood, go ahead. Has something to add.
Yeah, I just think one other point that we'd make with respect to convalescent therapy is, like with all therapies, there can be risks. And so that's another thing that one has to consider. And in the case of convalescent plasma therapies, there are a number of side effects, from relatively mild chills and fevers that can be associated with it to more severe lung-related injuries, even circulatory overload. So for that reason, as Soumya outlined, the clinical trial results are extremely important to know that we've got a clear demonstrated benefit, so that we can weigh both of these in considering the final recommendations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swaminathan and Dr. Aylward. The next question comes from Oriol from El País in Spain. Oriol, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hola, buenas tardes. Espero que creo que me oyen. Mire, les quería preguntar, el pasado viernes el Ministerio de Sanidad español informó de que en las siguientes horas se iba a quedar sin stocks de Remdesivir ante el aumento de la incidencia de casos en España. Se dijo también que iban a tratar de desviarse unidades destinadas al municipio, proyectos a programas de investigación para poder atender a los pacientes que ingresaban en los hospitales. Como saben ustedes, este fue un tema controvertido en su día cuando Estados Unidos anunció la compra de casi toda la producción hasta el mes de septiembre, y se dijo entonces que estaba garantizada el suministro a todos los países en todas las circunstancias a lo largo del verano y hasta que pudiera volverse a hacer el suministro habitual de medicamentos. Gillette, el laboratorio, ha dicho que va a poder hacer una nueva entrega a lo largo de esta semana. La pregunta es que se dijo que no iba a ocurrir y que ya ha ocurrido. Hay un país, no es pequeño precisamente, el quinto país de la Unión Europea, que durante al menos unos días o unas horas se ha visto sin un fármaco que, como ustedes saben, tiene unos beneficios limitados, no reduce la mortalidad por lo que se conoce ahora, pero sí unos días los ingresos. Pero quería preguntarles si no creen que sienta esto un precedente muy peligroso para lo que puede venir en los próximos meses, no solo con vacunas, sino con otros hipotéticos medicamentos que puedan tener un efecto mucho más importante en la reducción de la mortalidad y como operaciones comerciales unilaterales por parte de algunos países pueden poner el riesgo de otras personas en otras partes del globo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for the question, and I heard it in Spanish, so I hope I'll be able to respond completely. I think you raise a super important question, which is when you have one provider only of a medicine, and this risks the production globally. We do have a particular situation with the remdesivir because of the commitment in one country to buy the stocks of the originator, but we also have the bilateral agreements that the company, the originator, made with the generic producers, but this has not yet led to mass production elsewhere. Like you said, remdesivir is one example. It's the limited use for certain patients, severe patients, and it has shown only to reduce hospitalization and not reduce mortality yet. But it's one of the reasons why WHO is working so hard with the partners to make sure that whatever technology is out there, there is an increased capacity to address the market needs when they come out. Thank you very much for raising the issue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shmuel, for that answer. So we will now go to India, to Divya from the Economic Times in India. Divya, please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi. I just wanted to check if there is any update on the Solidarity trial for the drugs. And I have another question for Maria. Has there been any update on the Cerro study from India? They were supposed to present to WHO a few weeks back. Thank you so much.
I can start with the Solidarity trial. I'm hearing echo. Is it okay?
It's settling down, yes. I think you can go ahead.
So the status as of last week was that we had 24 countries that were actively enrolling in the Solidarity Therapeutics trial at about 400 hospitals and over 9,000 patients enrolled. As you know, we had discontinued two arms of the Solidarity trial, the lopinavir-ritonavir and the hydroxychloroquine arms, and this was based on interim analysis, which showed a lack of efficacy. So these arms were dropped for futility. And the two arms that are continuing at the moment are remdesivir and interferon beta. We're currently actively engaged with manufacturers discussing for inclusion for the next stage of this trial, looking both at anti-inflammatory drugs that can be used in hospitalized moderate to severely ill patients, but also at monoclonal antibodies that could also be used for treatment, as we were discussing earlier. So in the next couple of weeks, we will be ready to announce what the next stage of the Solidarity Therapeutics trial is looking at. And we will also have the data from the ongoing study ready for dissemination. But we've seen incredible cooperation and solidarity. We've had a number of countries waiting actually to start enrolling, and hopefully they will now join when we start the next phase of the study. But currently this is the second largest clinical trial in the world, having coming close to 10,000 patients, and also the largest trial that's looking at remdesivir with 3,000 patients randomized to remdesivir. So hopefully we will have a definitive answer on the impact of remdesivir, both on mortality and on clinical progression. Over.
Thank you. And Maria will answer the second part of the question.
Thanks. Yes. So as you mentioned, there are a number of serosurveys, seroepidemiology studies that are ongoing across the world, and there are a number that are currently being conducted in India. So there are some preliminary results that have come back looking at different antibody levels in different cities across the country. Some of them finding quite high levels of seropositivity. What we're trying to get a better understanding on from all of the seroepi studies that are occurring globally are the tests that are being used. So the different antibody tests measure different parts of the antibody response. Some of them do what is called IgM or IgG, and some are looking at neutralizing antibodies, and then there's a whole separate type of study that's looking at a cellular response. And in India, we're working to better understand which ones have looked at neutralizing antibodies, because these are quite important for us to understand the possible protection and how long that protection will last. But we work very closely with our regional office in Cerro and our country office in India. And in fact, a number of other additional studies will be conducted in India as part of what we call the Unity studies, which is using a standardized approach of conducting these types of investigations so that we can compare them across a large number of countries. But in India, in the preliminary results we've seen so far, in some areas that have been hardest hit, that have had high incidence levels, they've seen a higher measurement of those antibodies.
Thank you. I'm just double checking whether Dr. Mike Ryan wanted to add anything. No, that's. The next question goes to Sarah Wheaton from Politico. Sarah, could you unmute yourself and please go ahead. Sarah, could you unmute yourself and ask your question? We're not hearing you, Sarah. I'm really sorry. So, can we hear you now? I think.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Sorry about that. About COVAX, you've asked for the expressions of or confirmations of intent by August 31st, and is that a drop dead deadline, or if countries decide in December or March of 21, yeah, we probably should participate in this, is that still a possibility? Thank you very much.
One for Dr. Elwood, I think, again.
Sure, and some of you may want to come in on this. So there's a couple of deadlines that are coming up that are important. So the 31st of August is for the confirmation of intent, and then we'll have the financial commitment, or rather, expression of intent by the 31st of August. Sorry, to be really clear. And then the confirmation of intent is what happens on the 18th of September, and then by the 9th of October to have the initial payments in place. So those are the target dates that we're working toward. There always, and you'll understand this, there are challenges for countries in terms of sometimes legislative process, sometimes financial processes, etc. So we work with countries on a case-by-case basis to try and ensure that we can work with them toward those deadlines. We're still considering what would be the mechanism for countries that subsequently decide that they may wish to join. Some of you may want to speak to that issue if you had further information.
So I think the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a lot of discussions between countries, both in groups as well as individually, with the Secretariat of the COVAX facility, discussing what the different options are. And I think, as Bruce mentioned earlier, it's much more flexible now, and countries that have their own bilateral deals also have the opportunity to participate in the COVAX facility by having a number of different options. And there are also options for countries to make either commitments to purchasing a certain number of doses, or keeping their options by putting in, by investing a little bit upfront for retaining the right to purchase vaccines at a later date. We also expect to see a large number of vaccine candidates ultimately entering into this facility, starting with at least a couple in the early part of 2021. But investing in the facility now is going to give that long-term view, both the flexibility in terms of volumes, but also in terms of having a variety of different vaccines that countries could choose from to suit their own situation and their own populations. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swaminathan. And with that, I will close this press briefing because we've come up to the hour. I apologize to all of you in the queue with many questions. Please send your questions to mediainquiries@who.int, and we'll make sure we answer your questions, or you can hold them for the next press briefing. We will also provide the audio file and, as always, the text of the Director General's remarks. And now I will hand over to Dr. Tedros for his final remark.
Thank you, Margareta, and thank you to all for joining today, and see you in our next presser. Thank you. Have a nice day.